Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdson, a World Alternative Media here, and of course we're joined by author and economic analyst here at WAM, John Sneisen. And so we've been talking about Deutsche Bank for years and years now. There's always something new happening, and this one, maybe it's not so new per se, because of course Deutsche Bank's shares have been, tanking for quite some time now, but as the Danske scandal gets more and more in news coverage and gets noticed by more and more people, Deutsche Bank's shares are continuing to tank. And let's see this article out of Zero Hedge, which says Deutsche Bank shares hit record low on massive money laundering fears. And as the article goes into, DB shares dropped as much as 6% in Frankfurt, the largest one-day drop since May 31st. A Danske whistleblower said during testimony before the Danish parliament that a large European lender, which sources identify as Deutsche Bank, had cleared some $150 billion of suspicious money before severing its relationship with the Estonian branch in 2015, 2 years after JP Morgan is believed to have severed its own clearing relationship during de-risking of its dollar clearing business. Deutsche Bank shares were headed to an all-time lowest close in a recent trade, extending their year-to-date drop to 48% from their January highs. Deutsche Bank shares were down 3.1% in recent trade, compared with a 1.7% drop in the stock's 600 banks index. And you can see the charts there. To be clear, Deutsche Bank isn't a target of the DOJ investigation or any investigation, at least not that we know of. But given the recent bloodletting across the markets, even the slightest negative news could be enough to harm a company's shares. And I quote, "In the current environment, the slightest negative news is enough to make people leave risk assets, especially regarding sensible topics like money laundering." Now, before I go into the updates on this article, I do want to mention that especially including sensible topics like money laundering. Sensible. I feel like that's one of the least of my concerns, is people hiding their money from the government. But with that said, it's always interesting that these major banks that are, helping the government find people and track people who don't want their money stolen from them are also doing the same thing. So they're not practicing what they're preaching, obviously. It's amazing. Banks being fraudulent and lying to you, who would have thought? But looking at this update on the same article, it says, more international investigators are asking troubling questions about Deutsche's involvement with the Danske scandal. The latest is BaFin, the German financial markets regulator, which has asked the bank for more information about its correspondent banking activities, according to Reuters. German financial watchdog BaFin has asked Deutsche Bank to supply information on its dealings with Danske Bank, which is ensnarled in money laundering allegations, a source close to the matter said on Tuesday. After a fast evaluation of the data, BaFin will decide whether to launch a formal probe into Deutsche Bank, the source added. So, John, let's talk about this. This is interesting. I mean, we've talked before about, Deutsche Bank obviously having to do their living will. They're basically signing their own death warrant. They're talking about becoming, switching the definition of themselves as a bank. Their shares have been tanking. They've been involved in possibly, combining with Commerzbank. All these banks are bankrupt. Their cash to deposit ratio is astonishingly low. Deutsche Bank is actually better than a lot of the major banks, which says a lot. What do you think, John, about this recent story out of Zero Hedge?
Well, I think Deutsche Bank is in trouble, as they always are. They're always a bunch of criminals. Well, the truth is, with most banks, we can't just go after just Deutsche Bank or Wells Fargo. There's a lot of bad activities happening with everybody. And then, of course, they have litigation funds that they built up for this criminal activity. So they actually have the funding to pay the dues to the government in order to get away with their criminal activities. So it's nothing new about this, Josh. And also there's the Swedish bank Nordea that got brought into this whole money laundering scheme as well. So they are another part of this, and Scandinavian banks, who knows, maybe even DNB, the biggest bank in Norway, is going to be brought into this, because a lot of these Scandinavian banks have branches over in over in the Baltic countries, which there is a lot of criminal activities there, a lot of gangs and so on, especially in Lithuania, that comes into Norway. They probably launder money back from all the money, like from all the stuff that they stolen from people. So there's a lot of that going on in Scandinavia. And but to get back to Deutsche Bank and the problems over in Germany. Actually, Germany isn't even the biggest problem when it comes to lending and over borrowing money. It's actually the French banks are even worse off than the German banks through my recent research on the BIS international banking data that I pulled. So it's even worse in France, but nobody's talking about the French banks, which I think is actually might be in worse shape, BNP Paribas and others, and Societe Generale. No, sorry, BNP Paribas is Spanish, but that one is also in trouble because Spain has a lot of debt borrowed to a lot of other countries. And if we go and take a quick look, Josh, at my stats that I pulled on Germany and who have they borrowed to, who is their counterparty risks, it's interesting. The top riskiest countries is the United States, the UK, France, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Italy and Switzerland, and Spain. And all of these, like just the biggest five, you're looking at over $1 trillion or borrow money to these countries. Citizens and businesses and so on. And I'm going to read from my book, Canada, not Canada, the greatest economy in the world, The End of Freedom, How Our Monetary System Enslaves Us. I have a chart there actually showing which banks have actually borrowed to the Greek government. And interestingly enough, you were talking about Commerce Bank and emerging. Commerce Bank actually owes more money than both Societe Generale and Deutsche Bank they lent more money to the Greek government than anybody else. So actually on that side too, you have Commerce Bank, which is a better rating of credit than, of course, Commerce Bank has. Deutsche Bank has. It's better for them. But right now, I'm just looking at the credit default swap, the 5-year credit default swap on Deutsche Bank, and that one is getting close to the record highs over a year term. It was higher back when the cocoa bonds was going and reaching havoc on the markets like earlier in like last year. But we're getting up to the new level again now where it's at 175. The record high was at about 179 this year. So you're seeing another problematic push now of all these issues, and also we got to remember that Deutsche Bank is also one of the you could call it like the Americans use Deutsche Bank as the derivative central of the European Union, and you see a lot of derivatives that have come out of Germany. Just as an example here, so for example, to the UK. They've lent 294.19. The German banks have, and the Deutsche Bank is of course a major bank there, so you can see how much they've been borrowing, and of that they actually created derivatives on 241 billion of that. So that's almost everything has been created a derivative on. On top of that, like just with UK banks, and then with the United States, it's about a little over under a quarter. Then you have France. It's you're talking about 30% or so. Yeah. So you're looking at like how much on top of this risk spread throughout the markets that the German bank has lent to other countries as well. So you not only have like the risk in Germany, which is actually one of the more solid places, but they also have a big problem with the demographics being on the downward trend, like in Japan was in the 90s. So you're looking at the same thing happening in Germany, where they're really starting to struggle their economy. And when you have a demographic cliff going down and there's not enough people to borrow to, they have a problem as well with not being able to pay off the interest on that debt, Josh.
Yeah, sure. And of course, when they only pay the interest alone as well, that's obviously a sign that they have no plans to pay off the debt. I want to kind of shift a little bit because we talked about Deutsche Bank, I think, for the first time on WAM in like 2015, and then into early 2016 we were talking about the fact that at that time they had a derivative exposure of $75 trillion, while the whole country of Germany itself only had a GDP of $3.5 trillion, and the global GDP, yearly is $75 trillion. So it's absolutely insane. They could be a huge domino to knock the rest over. And of course, the derivative bubble worldwide is multi-quadrillion dollar level. I want to also mention that we are seeing the stock markets in countries around the world take a huge hit, bond markets, forex trading, and of course even cryptocurrencies, which we talked about in a recent video, where we're seeing, like you mentioned, very likely that people are pulling out of crypto to pay for their losses in stocks and bonds and etc., and which could work both ways in the end. Everything is manipulated. We've talked countless times about all the cases of manipulation coming out of Deutsche Bank, but of course everyone blames Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank is a good one to blame because they are very guilty, but every bank does it. And we just saw finally, despite over the years, Deutsche Bank going to court over this, being found guilty for silver and gold rigging, and HSBC, BNP Paribas, and all these other banks,
and JP Morgan,
getting caught in the crosshairs. Yeah, well, that's what I'm getting at, is like we just found out finally, we have it solidified. JP Morgan, one of their traders, is going to jail for spoofing markets, gold and silver. I believe it was silver mostly, but overall, this is something that everyone does at these big banks, and it's just kind of under the radar. But let's face it, folks, this is an obvious thing that the big banks do. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, it's just so ironic to see these banks, giving all this information to the government and providing the IRS and all these major revenue, quote-unquote, services. Service, that's ironic too. But it's ironic seeing them provide all this information to the government, and then they do the same thing. And we also see that with a lot of countries and loans. And you went into it in your mapping, John, where you see that the Cayman Islands is a major factor in play when it comes to debt and borrowing to different countries around the world and everything. So I think it's really important that we understand that we need to get outside the banking system, because if your money's in the bank, it's not yours, it's a bank's, folks. And these banks are heavily entrenched in fractional reserve lending and zero reserve policies and all this insanity. And I could see John is getting the charting up so that it gives me lots of editing to do later when I do this video. But go ahead, John. Before you do that, just let us know, where do you see this going in the future? How long can Deutsche Bank possibly sustain this? Because it's amazing that this bank is still in business at all, when we see this constantly bearish news coming out, this constantly falling share price. I mean, how are they even functioning anymore?
Well, Josh, what you got to understand is their business is, of course, borrowing money. And that's what they've been doing. The ECB has used Commerzbank and Deutsche Bank as bailout mechanisms to all of Europe. Yeah. They've been borrowing all this money to everywhere in Europe, and they're the major financial institutions. They're the major bank, one of them, the biggest bank in Europe, I would say. So what is happening is they have been used to basically give out debt that cannot ever be paid back, because they're just prolonging this default of countries, but they're afraid that they're going to have that default, because at that time, everybody's going to see what the scam is all about. The whole monetary system will fall apart. So they are willing to just continue to print this into oblivion, Josh. And I think during the next market correction that we are likely to see very soon, we are going to see just a mass amount of more printing. Who knows, that they're probably going to have to do a bailout again, or they could just say we're going to recapitalize all the banks. As you see with the cash to deposit ratios, there's not very much money for the general public to get out. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the deposit insurance corporations, like the EU was talking about getting rid of it, with the head of the ECB saying that, Mario Draghi. So you're seeing that they are, preparing.
Can't wait, bail-in regimes.
They're preparing. Well, the bail-in is recapitalization. It's just another word for it. That's it sounds better because people don't understand what the heck a recapitalization means. But anyways, it's just insane. And I just pulled up the numbers because we were talking about about Cayman Islands, which is the mega hub for talking about money laundering and all this tax evasion. But there's also that's where most of the banks are actually borrowing their money to. On a worldwide scale, Josh, there's 1.42 trillion dollars but just borrowed to the Cayman Islands. Tiny little island nation, so it's interesting to see that how this tiny little island nation has so much money. There's clearly a lot of people that are trying to get out of the problems of the government, and of course, there's a lot of sinister activity also that goes on with these banks and their criminal activities. And the funniest thing is, of course, half of this, Josh, is from Japanese banks. So it's just crazy how these banks are just printing so much money, and we're getting to the numbers where the numbers are just starting to baffle me, Josh, and I'm about to pull out the total amount of debt in the world according to the Bank of International Settlements. Now, of course, I haven't been able to get the actual local banks the actual other countries that are not, under the BIS jurisdiction. So I haven't gotten that data, so that has to be accounted for. But of course, the biggest nations are there, so you get most of it. But it's interesting. These banks are just created like a whole scheme of lending out money, and they're making money on their fees, their interest rates, and so on. They only make money on lending out money to people with interest, and that's their major business model. And then of course they take fees, surcharges. Then they try to play you, make sure that you fail on paying your bills and stuff like that, or you don't have sufficient money in your account, so they scheme you there. There's lots of schemes that the government that these banks are using to siphon off value out of your account. And why do we still want to entrust these banks? We can clearly see that all this corrupt activity. I think it is because people doesn't know where to go, like they doesn't know what to do with themselves. Yeah. And they say, well, I'm just gonna take out all my money in cash. Well, you're gonna have to try to find other ways and a different type of monetary system to move forward with that is uncorruptible in its way, that you can't print a whole bunch of it into thin air. Like cryptocurrencies, for example, is a great example of that. And then throughout history, you have other commodities throughout the gold and silver and so on that is way more powerful and can take away power from the banks. Now, of course, JP Morgan and others have a lot of physical metal that you probably won't see anything of. But we're going to have to try to decentralize ourselves away from these corrupt, bankster created systems that have, been in control, ever since they created banking 1,000 years plus ago.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. And I think it's really important that we look at the fact that they are preparing, and if they're preparing, they know something that we don't know, or well, maybe some of us watching this and us, reporting this know about it. But for the most part, I mean, a lot of people don't realize that they're preparing for something big, a big power shift, a big crash, a big collapse. I mean, it has to happen. All fiat currencies have eventually reverted to their true value of zero, going back to 1024 AD in China. It's almost 1,000 years, folks. Let's learn from that. Let's look at the solutions, which are the most important part. Like John mentioned, decentralized cryptocurrencies. Everyone's freaking out about the market falling out. We've done a video on this explaining this. This isn't about, a permanent crash. This is an innovative market in its infancy that's just getting started, and it makes sense for it to dip after a massive bubble. It makes sense that we need to see this volatility in order to actually prosper in the market long term. So we have to be patient. It's not about speculation. But also, of course, this is not investment advice. This is our opinion. It's just fact, though. If you look into it, you have to be financially educated, self-sustainable, independent, rule yourself, decentralize everything, diversify your portfolio. So gold and silver are great wealth insurance of purchasing power, which you need to protect against these massive crises around the world. And of course, food, water, shelter, self-defense, so you're not gathering things for the toughest guy on the block. There are ways around this. There are more solutions than there are problems. So let's understand that. Let's move forward with that. Let's stop looking to ourselves as victims and start looking forward. Instead of looking in the rear view mirror, we have to look at the road in front of us, or else we're going to crash, folks. And we have to take advantage of all the opportunities in our down the road from us. And if we don't, and we sit back and don't accept the fact that we are moving into new territory, then, well, we're going to allow the government and banking system to progress much faster than us, and they will prevail if we just ignore the very real potentials of real solutions and instead let them develop on these solutions. Like, instead of the decentralized cryptocurrencies, the centrally planned digital currencies that they have in China. Big difference, major issue. We need to develop faster than them, and the free market always prevails. But breaking free from that, John, bottom line as we close out this report regarding Deutsche Bank and all this craziness happening around the world.
Well, the bottom line here is that banks are criminal. It's just their business model that thrives on creating new money out of thin air. And that's what we got to understand. We got to have to move away from that. And don't move to credit unions either, because I clearly have shown through my research that credit unions are actually mostly worse than banks.
Way bankrupt.
Yeah, and that's really scary, because most people that are against the banks, they say like, yeah, we're going with credit unions, and the credit unions are screwing them over even worse. So it's you gotta have to debank yourself and start to look for other ways of transacting value between each other, because if we don't, this banking cartel ruling the world is just going to continue to siphon off money. I was just recently watching an interview by one of the most infamous mafia bosses throughout history in New York, and that's what the banks are. They're mafia. They're coming in and stealing and siphoning off and taking out money out of the economy, and that's what they're doing. They're a massive cartel that actually print the money, because they print most of the money. The federal government just goes in deficit, but they can create 10 to 100 times more money. The commercial banks, so that they are the cartel, they are the mafia that's running this world, and we got to stand up against them, and we shouldn't be afraid, because when something happens at the banks, they just kill off. Like, suddenly there's a guy accidentally shooting himself in the head like 4 or 5 times with a nail gun and stuff like that in banks. So they if they
falling from buildings backwards.
Yeah, and they, of course, like the top guys, which are the Dons, basically, like JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon, and Goldman Sachs, they got a new guy, I totally forgot his name, but these guys are the Dons of the modern-day mafia banking that are the financial terrorists. There are killing economies around the world. They're siphoning off wealth. They're stealing constantly, and they're constantly, luring you in. Come into the stock market while we're selling all our assets, and then you lose all the value. They're a bunch of criminals, Josh. On the top side, like, I'm not talking about people sitting in the branches, because most of them doesn't understand. But it's the top guys again, that are the criminal masterminds behind it, and we got to stop this. Debank yourself. That's
yeah, absolutely. And of course, decentralize everything, folks. Rule yourselves and be responsible, because freedom and responsibility go hand in hand. Thanks for going into this with us, John. And until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson and John Sneisen signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth,
be the change.
Like what you see here, OM? Don't forget to check the links below. GoFundMe, Patreon. We can't do it without you. Any donation is very much appreciated, especially as we are so vastly demonetized and censored on YouTube, as these guys come in and flag all of our content as hate speech. Also, check out our Bitcoin address below, as well as on the screen for you to scan if you please. And also check us out at steemit.com. We're at Josh Sigurdson. It's a future of social media where you get paid in the upvote of your post in cryptocurrency. Steem, that is. So make sure to check us out there. Make sure to join us at Anarchapulco 2019 with people like Ron Paul, G. Edward Griffin, of course, Jeff Berwick, Vid Jedlicka. So many incredible speakers are going to be speaking. It's just a massively growing event. It is something you have to see to believe. So make sure to check it out below and save money on your tickets by using promo code WAM, that's WAM, and I hope to see you there. Also, check out our newsletter as we are getting demonetized and censored and all that. We don't know what comes next, so we have an email, worldalternativemedia@gmail.com. Send us an email with subject line YES, YES, and we will include you in the newsletter, where we will continuously keep you updated. So until next time, thanks for watching, everyone. This is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
I'm sure you have already changed people's minds in your young age because you're involved, and I like that.